Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back for another exciting episode of your guided readings. This installment is 5.5 Parliament Limits the English Monarchy. In this section, we're going to see kind of the opposite of what we've seen in a lot of other countries. A lot of other countries, the monarchs have been gaining power, they've been taking power from the nobles, and they've been moving towards absolute monarchies. In this section, we're moving in the opposite direction. That means that the English monarchy its power is being limited, and the body that does that is Parliament. Now you got to understand what a Parliament is. A Parliament is a body in a government that makes laws. Oftentimes in modern day, they're elected representatives. But back in the day here in England, we're going to talk more about the parliament system that was set up then, and that parliamentary system was much more made up of lords and nobles. And so in this case, we see some of the lords and nobles limiting the English monarchy. So let's get started and take a look. This notes section is set up so that you have a ruler, a monarch from the English government, and as you read through, as we go through, we're going to describe the relations between this ruler and the Parliament. So we're going to start with James I. Here he is there, sitting, taking a look at us. James I, first of all, inherited a lot of debt. The ruler before him was Queen Elizabeth I, and she had a lot of debt that she passed on to the next person in line. And so James had to deal with all this money that he owed already. So oftentimes he would have struggles with the Parliament over money. James would say that he wanted to raise taxes. The Parliament wouldn't be happy about it. And so because he was in such debt, he really needed money, and they weren't really happy to make it happen. The other thing about James that sometimes people weren't happy about is that he didn't want to make Puritan reforms. Now, we've looked at the Puritans before. We know that some of them eventually went to settle colonies in the Americas. But the Puritans, that part of society, really wanted James to make deeper reforms in the Church of England, to make it less and less Catholic. And he wasn't so happy to do that. He didn't really enact the reforms that they wanted to. Okay, the next ruler we're going to talk about is Charles I. This is a pretty important guy in English history, so you're going to need a lot of room to write here. You may want to write some of these notes on the bottom or on the top of your paper in order to be able to fit all of them. Just write small so you can get as much in the Charles I box as possible. So, Charles I, first of all, he's often at war with two of England's enemies, Spain and France, so he needs a lot of money. We've studied this before. When you have wars, they cost money. So Charles needed money constantly. One of the things that Parliament said was, okay, Charles, we'll give you some money. However, there's going to be some conditions. The first condition that they offered was the Petition of Right. What did the Petition of Right say? Well, a couple things that you need to know. It said more than what I'm going to explain, but these two things you really should know and need to know for your upcoming test. First of all, he needs Parliament's consent to raise taxes. Consent is when you allow someone or let someone do something. So what Parliament was saying is, yeah, we'll raise taxes this time, but you have to agree in this Petition of Right that in the future, if you want to raise taxes, you have to get the okay from us, from the Parliament. Another thing the Petition of Right addressed was that Charles is not able to imprison people without due cause. What that means is he can't put someone in jail without a reason. There's got to be a cause for why he put them into jail. So this is kind of an important, this is going to be the second slide about Charles. This is kind of an important document because, as you can see here in letter C, the Petition of Right was the first time in England that the king agreed to limit his royal power. Right? Now, Charles ignored most of what was in the Petition of Right, but it didn't matter because people already saw that Charles started to agree to this. This is taking away from the idea of having an absolute monarch that has power and control over everything. Charles is agreeing, on paper at least, to limit some of his powers. All right, eventually later, because Charles keeps ignoring some of the things that he promised he would do, and because he wants more money and Parliament's not giving it to him, eventually England erupts into a civil war. Now, a civil war is when a country is fighting within itself. It's not fighting against another country. There's two parts of the country that are fighting for control to dominate the country. And Charles was fighting against people who decided that he was not a good ruler and that he was bad for the country and that he wasn't following the rules that he promised to. And so the war fought on for several years, and in the end, Charles's enemies win. And Charles is charged with treason. Treason is when you have turned against your country or betrayed your country. And so Charles is found guilty, and that gets us the letter E here. Charles eventually is put to death. That's called regicide. We've studied before that anything with "icide" at the end means death, like suicide. Or we also talked quickly about infanticide. This is regicide, when you kill a king. Now, this was kind of a revolutionary thing to happen because this was one of the first public executions of a king. In the past, kings may have been killed in battle, or maybe they were murdered secretly, and their heir would take over. But this was very different because this was Charles put on trial in public, in front of everyone, found guilty of treason, and then beheaded publicly in front of everyone. And you can imagine many of the monarchs in Europe were horrified that this could happen. And this was very different, obviously, than the idea of divine right. God chose the monarch, so he should be there. This is kind of the exact opposite. This is people choosing whether or not the king should be there. And beyond that, people choosing that the king was a traitor to the country and that he should be executed by the government in front of everyone. So that was kind of a revolutionary occurrence to happen for a king to be killed this way. Okay, one of the people that were fighting against Charles and that kind of were in favor of his removal from power was Oliver Cromwell. And after Charles's execution, the people that were against the king kind of took power, and Oliver Cromwell was in charge. So one of the first things Oliver Cromwell did, moving much further away from an absolute monarchy, he abolished the monarchy. And we know that abolish means to end or terminate something. He also got rid of the House of Lords, which was part of the Parliament, in which these were rich nobles that had a say in government. And Cromwell said, nope, no more. We are moving towards a republic where we don't have a king and where we don't have these rich nobles running things. He eventually sent the rest of Parliament home too because they weren't always agreeing with him. So imagine that. It sounds very similar to when a king was in power. And in fact, over time, Cromwell stopped listening to many other people and became a dictator. So Cromwell started off with the idea of getting rid of the monarchy, but by the end, we found Cromwell in a position where he was acting just like any other king as a dictator. And so people wanted to get rid of this kind of government because they said, you know, if we're going to have someone that's ruling like this, we might as well have our king back. And that's exactly what they did. After Cromwell died, shortly after, they invited Charles II to come and rule for England. Charles II was Charles I's son. So a couple things that happened during Charles II's reign. First of all, he set up habeas corpus. And this is one of your key words that you need to know. You can see a picture of the written document of habeas corpus down there. First of all, this limited the king's power to imprison people. Secondly, it stated that there must be a reason for imprisonment. So, in other words, Charles couldn't put someone in jail without having a legitimate reason. And in your book, it talks about that you need a habeas corpus represents that you need a document to prove your charge, to say what you've been charged with. Why are you being sent to jail? And in effect, what this meant was that you couldn't put someone in jail unless you had a reason to put them in jail. Okay, so that was the major contribution that Charles made, and that was part of his negotiations with Parliament. Now, when Charles died, Parliament was worried because he didn't have a legitimate heir. And the person that ended up coming down to rule England was actually the Scottish king at the time. His name was James II. Now, James II is an interesting character as well, because James II was a Catholic. Britain had been fighting wars. Britain had been fighting civil wars in the past. There had been a lot of ups and downs in terms of Catholicism versus Protestantism in England. And for finally a long time, England was kind of settled in being Protestant. And then, lo and behold, Charles II dies, and the next in line is James II, who's a Catholic. Now, James didn't let this get him down. He kept Catholicing on. He decided, just because England had rules that they weren't supposed to have Catholics in high positions, well, he's the king, so he's going to do it anyway. So he appointed Catholics into high positions in the English government. Now, this did not make Parliament happy. They protested. They told him that it was illegal. They told him that he couldn't change England back to Catholicism after all these years as being a Protestant. And James said, fine, go home. He dissolved the Parliament, which means he sent them home. He ended the Parliament. So Parliament knew that James actually had a daughter and a son-in-law. They were living in Holland at the time. And they were Protestants, and so they weren't Catholics. So the Parliament was kind of excited about that they could have someone else in power instead. And in fact, they invited those two, and we're going to talk about them next, they're William and Mary, to come and take over from James. Now, this is called the Glorious Revolution, and what actually happened was, you would think that maybe James would stay and fight and try to defend his position, but actually, James ran away. He left England. And he allowed William and Mary to take over. And that's what's called the Glorious Revolution. So there they are. What a cute couple, William and Mary. A couple things about William and Mary. When they came to power, Parliament said, okay, we have a good opportunity here. We've got two people coming in to try to take over the crown. We want them to come in primarily because they're Protestant and they're not Catholic like James II was. But while we're making negotiations to get them to come, we're going to get a chance to increase our power as a parliament. And so they made kind of a deal. William and Mary had to agree to a few things before they could actually come and rule and be crowned the King and Queen of England. And so they had to sign what was called the Bill of Rights. Now, in the Bill of Rights, there's quite a few things, but there's two main points that I want you to know and understand. First, no interfering with freedom of speech of Parliament. Parliament can say what it wants without the King and Queen getting angry, putting them in prison, or taking away their titles or lands or anything like that. Secondly, the king cannot levy taxes. That means place taxes on the people without a specific grant from Parliament. So in other words, Parliament has to give permission for the King and Queen to put up taxes. Again, the Bill of Rights is limiting the king's power and strengthening the power of the Parliament. Basically, what this amounted to, the Bill of Rights, was that William and Mary had to recognize that Parliament was their ruling partner. Again, moving further away from absolute monarchy, in that the English kings and queens had to share power with Parliament. They were partners in ruling. And thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you guys tomorrow.